I'm the Executive Director, CEO of the Institute for Nonprofit News. And we are going to speak a bit about Canada. And full disclosure, because we at the Institute for Nonprofit News, or INN, believe in financial transparency. So we have, and our members, our 493 members, have been funded by the Google News Initiative. And you should always know who invests in something when you're hearing a conversation. So I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is Erin Millar. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Indiegraf, which is a technology company that powers about 150 community news organizations across the US and Canada. I am based in Canada, and I'm also the chair of the Canadian Journalism Collective, which is the nonprofit that has been created in Canada to distribute Google's $100 million a year contribution to the Canadian news ecosystem.
I'm Richard Gingras. I've spent basically 50 years at the intersection of media, technology, and public policy. Started out in public broadcasting, worked in the Carter White House on policy. Obviously spent 15 years at Google, largely as global head of news, but now that I'm in a very advanced stage of life, I'm simply a strategic advisor at Google on various areas, but I also spend a lot of time these days on the Center for News Technology and Innovation. I was a founding board member there, which is looking, frankly, at trying to really pursue the big questions of what is the future of journalism in open societies, and whether that's a public policy question or how do we understand trust, how do we understand business models. And I'm also personally involved in several dimensions in the local news arena, where I think there's both tremendous need and tremendous opportunity if we can best figure out how to get there.
Thank you, Richard. So, of course, this panel is about Canada and some of the interesting things that have happened there around local news. And I think it's important that we just sort of acknowledge that we are looking for solutions wherever they may be. So we are not only looking across different cities, different regions, we are looking to the north, we are looking to Canada, we are looking to other nations. So let's just level set a bit. Canada, 40 million people, indigenous populations have been there for thousands of years, 90% Asian population, a few cities with the most population, including Toronto and Vancouver and Montreal, and fully bilingual. Legal languages are English and French, sparsely populated in a lot of areas. So that's a little bit about the nation. And then, of course, the Online News Act, which was passed June of 2023, and the Canadian Journalism Collective now has the dollars. And why don't we just talk about first what the Online News Act meant, Erin, and how the bargaining came about.
Sure. So the Online News Act has been in the works for many, many years, I guess, and was initially envisioned as it's set up as a collective bargaining agreement that essentially allows news organizations to come together and bargain collectively with digital intermediaries is the term, which the definition really only captures Google and Meta. And essentially it tries to use a legislative stick to force the big tech companies to the table to make a deal to fund Canadian media. There's all sorts of things in that act that are not actually what has happened in terms of implementation because of the things that resulted when it passed. So there's a set of regulations as well that outlines exactly the ways in which Google is able to get an exemption to the act. So that's actually structurally how we are where we're at today, is that the act exists and Google has an exemption to the act and was able to get that from the government by negotiating this contribution. Meta, on the other hand, chose to remove Canadian news from their platforms, which they did. shortly after the act passed. And so you can currently not access original Canadian news content through Facebook or Instagram, although you can access a lot of stuff that kind of looks and smells like news content. So we can talk about the impact of that as well. I'll stop there. And
Richard, would you explain a little bit about how it came about that Google decided to get into the bargaining with the newsrooms?
Well, I mean, I think folks are probably aware that we've had a long-standing interest in and have supported many efforts regarding the journalistic ecosystem around the world. No different in Canada. I spent, frankly, 10 years working closely with publishers in Canada of all types and stripes. In fact, to me, one of the most unfortunate things about the Canadian situation with C18 is Canada has one of the most innovative environments of emerging players is any country in the world. Erin being one of them with the discourse in Indiegraf. The Globe and Mail does marvelous work and is successful and profitable. You've got, I think, probably the best example of a strong community-oriented provider of news digitally in Village Media, which is community-focused and profitable through advertising in its communities, right? Enormously successful. Great lesson for all of us. So interestingly, when C18 came along, which not surprisingly was largely driven by the legacy publishers, that was clearly a challenge to us. I think, frankly, it was a challenge in many regards to the emerging ecosystem itself. One thing I've learned in my efforts around the world, if you talk to a legacy publishing association, I remember one telling me in another part of the world saying, Richard, we'd be a whole lot more pleasant toward Google if you'd stop working with the emerging players. All right? There's a competitive dynamic there that you just cannot avoid and ignore. And so when I look at public policy in general, I say, should there be public policy relating to news? If a society decides that that's the case, then yes. But be very thoughtful and careful as to how you approach it. So the situation in Canada was, it was a bargaining code based on the leverage of a link tax, right? I would say that net, the result of that effort in Canada was not positive for the news industry in Canada. Right? And specifically, a link tax is a rather almost self-destructive approach to use if a news organization is interested in getting traffic, saying, oh, yeah, we love the traffic you're getting, we expect you now to pay us for the use of the links, because that's what C18 did. It took away our fair use privileges for a link and a snippet, right? So clearly that was a problem. I think if there's a good thing out of C18, and there are many negatives, as you pointed out, Meta is out, right? That is deeply problematic to any of these emerging news organizations looking to build audiences as Canada, right? But if there was a net positive, there are two things out of it that I would cite as a net positive. One was we did step forward and were able to negotiate an arrangement such that the link tax did not apply, right? Again, it's bad public policy in my view, because it gets in the way of people accessing news. And the second is that, because I think in all of these approaches that one might want to talk about in terms of public policy to support the news industry, the second really important question is how will that money be distributed? And can that money be distributed in an approach that services the diverse needs of the society, the diverse needs of the ecosystem, and does not predominantly focus on those who are embedded and already in power, good, bad, or indifferent politically or not, right? So one thing out of our agreement with the government was, could we indeed select an entity, not us, to distribute the funds? And great good fortune, Erin stepped forward and came forward with a really solid application for how to do that, with a strong emphasis on transparency, with a strong emphasis on a diverse governance structure, and with a willingness to deal with some of the thorny issues of who qualifies and how do we appropriately address that, such that hopefully long-term, C18, or the dollars that we've provided as a result of that, can have a net positive impact on the growth, particularly of the emerging ecosystem of Canada. And I think that's that's the wild card that we don't yet know.
Erin, there are a couple of things to consider. I do want to talk about Meta and Facebook, and there's what it did to the news publisher's business, and there's what it does to an informed public. So would you speak to both?
Yeah, so I'd love to circle back on the question at some point of whether C18 is a net positive or when we might be able to know. I don't know that we know yet, but first, definitely one of the really negative outcomes of C18 was Meta pulling Canadian news content. This happened in the summer. The law passed in June, and they pulled Canadian news content off almost immediately. But this happened just as wildfire season was ramping up. One of my other hats, you mentioned the Discourse, which is a organization that I founded that is a chain of digital local news outlets that are mostly in rural communities. And so during that period, I had a really front row seat on what it means to all of a sudden lose access when we had been training our audiences to look to Facebook for that breaking news. In these rural communities, we're the only, I'm thinking about Sun Peaks Independent News, which is in a mountainous area in the interior of British Columbia. And people were DMing me and the CEO of Discourse asking us am I under wildfire watch? So the impact was really, really profound initially. In terms of the impact on the business, it's obviously Facebook and Instagram are major drivers of traffic. That disproportionately impacted different kinds of organizations, and we found that emerging organizations that are still building audience are more reliant on things like boosting their content through social media in order to reach those audiences. So definitely had an impact there. But what we really found was that Indiegraf supports a lot of different publishers, so I was able to look at the data cross-set across different types of communities, and it disproportionately impacted Indigenous and new immigrant communities that tend to look to Facebook and have very vibrant communities there to connect Indigenous folk. There's a lot that are based in urban centers that use Facebook to connect back to their traditional lands or hear what's happening on the First Nation where they're connected, they have membership, and so it had a disproportionate impact on those news organizations that had a higher level of traffic. So of course, that all trickled down into people's revenue. Our advertising is a function, our advertising revenue is a function of our traffic, of course. Some organizations were very smart and pivoted very quickly to build direct owned audiences and lean into their email newsletters, and that's what we did at Indiegraf. It was an eye-opener to say, and I think there's a lot of innovative lessons that are very relevant to US publishers, because it's not that Meta did it to us very abruptly, but they've been leaning away from news everywhere. And so it was an eye-opener to say, you know what, we can't rely on a third-party organization that does not have the public interest to own the infrastructure by which we connect as citizens of our communities. We need to build this infrastructure ourselves. And so a lot of us started doing that. I'm seeing Jeanette Aegison here in the front, who's the publisher of the Tyee, that is in better financial and audience is larger than it's ever been before in 2025. They're 20 years old now, but an early digital publishing pioneer in Canada, and they were able to really do some innovative things to get beyond that and are stronger than ever. So there's some bright lights among that, but it's been a very challenging and difficult period for a lot of organizations, and a lot just shut down as a result because their finances were so precarious anyhow.
Were you going to add something?
No, I would just add, and she's absolutely correct. In fact, just one other anecdote. I mentioned Village Media, which is, really come up with a very sweet model. They typically could launch a new city and get to cash flow positive in, say, 6 to 9 months. Now, as a result of not having Facebook there, that early audience development effort, which was largely about building the newsletter subscriptions, they now figure it's going to be probably more likely a year to 15 or 16 months. to profitability, simply because they don't have that boosted opportunity to drive audience.
Yeah, I'm sorry to be so long-winded on this, but can I add two more quick things? Building from
course.
that, Village Media is one of the fastest-growing local news organizations in Canada. They're hiring, they're growing. It's really an incredible story. And they were a great example because there was just when C-18 passed and it was unclear what was going to happen with Google. Google was saying maybe they would pull out too. There was no line of sight towards the $500 million that we're now involved in distributing. It just put a total damper on investment in the industry. Everybody was needed to hold on to their dry powder to see what we were getting through. And you can see it in the numbers. There's a wonderful research project that tracks openings and closures that's been going on for decades now. By April Lindgren is the researcher, and you can see there's like local news startups are like growing year after year, and then it hits 2022, and then there's nothing. All of that progress that we built towards like creating new organizations in news deserts, et cetera, just came to a halt. So that like chill on investment was really negative. And then you mentioned as well, the third point that I wanted to say was the impact on consumers, news consumers. There was a research paper that was done at McGill that talked about a year with no news, and it did a survey of news consumers. And what really jumped out to me about that was that most Canadians didn't know that news is not available to them. And that's there's been these clickbait farms that have popped up that smell and look like news. A lot of the time they're ripping off copyright from news organizations. They are not eligible under the Act, so there's a total black box at Meta about how they decide who is blacklisted and who's not. We don't know that. They're deciding. And a lot of these organizations have filled that hole and are making a lot of money off of that. It's created like dozens and dozens of these things that aren't actually news organizations that are pretending to be news. So that's gotten to the point where now our populace doesn't even recognize what real news is, which is, we won't yet see the long-term impacts of that for some time.
And I should add, and I'm no means going to be a defender of Meta and the decisions they made. However, let's be realistic, right? It would not have happened had it not been a link tax approach. That's the negative of taking a link tax approach to things. And by the way, what they will tell you, and whether you believe them or not, since they've withdrawn news, given how people feel about news these days, customer satisfaction went up and engagement did not go down, right? I mean, we tend to forget that in a social network like Facebook, the ideal situation is like my daughter sharing photos of her new child such that I might see an ad for a clever gift and click on it, right? News is not the primary driver of engagement in a social network environment. And unfortunately, you take a link tax bill and you make the situation even worse. Devastatingly bad. And again, I don't say this to defend Facebook, but let's understand the realities of the environment.
So I think we need to speak about June of 2023. We're now February 2025. You have the money, Erin, and some of it, but not all of it, has been distributed, correct?
We are about to write our first check to news
Okay.
organizations.
Okay.
It's not yet out the door, but will
Okay.
happen very, very soon. Yeah,
All
this
right.
quarter.
There's a lot of time in between there, and you have to negotiate with the different members, the different newsrooms, to figure out what's equitable, and you're doing this in part based on full-time employees. So would you explain what that looks like?
Sure, just to give a very, very quick timeline. The law passed in June of 2023. That's right. That gave a 6-month window for before it came into effect. During that time, I wasn't in the room, so you'll have to ask Richard what was going on, because he was Google. I'm sure you were there, but Google was negotiating directly with the government.
Let's ask him, Richard.
Yeah.
Richard, what was going
happening? Tell us what happened between June.
A lot of wrangling, for sure.
on? Which means arguing.
Arguing, debating, discussing, frankly, just trying to find a solution, right? And we were early on, and I spent a lot of time in Ottawa. I testified before the Senate and the House. I mean, we engaged in every way we could, directly and indirectly. And all from the very beginning saying, this is not really the way you want to do this. This will not end well. But we would like to find a solution with you. And that's how we ended up where we ended up. Like I said, is maybe the best reasonable solution outside of with an act that frankly was, in my view, not the right approach to public policy in the first place.
Yeah, so it was in December that the Canadian government, led by our Heritage Ministry, came to agreement with Google. And I want to underline this because I think it's an important feature to understand about this approach. As publishers, and I represent independent, smaller publishers through my work, we were on the outside of the negotiation. So the law itself was intended to create a bargaining code for news organizations to negotiate directly with Google. We actually never really negotiated directly with Google. That number, that $100 million a year, was established by our government. And they were, of course, subject to lobbying by the news industry throughout this period. And of course, like just getting back to one of the objectives for my own involvement in this is to make those deals actually equitable and serve the ecosystem, all players, fairly rather than only flow to larger organizations. Obviously, when there's a negotiation happening between government and Google in a closed room that is only being influenced by the news businesses who have lobbying resources, that is not an equitable way to do a negotiation.
So, though interestingly, the key thing out of that, because the one thing that I was very strongly insistent on in those conversations was A, that we not be in the middle of distributing the funds, and that B, we have an opportunity to find an appropriate structure that would do well by that. Because I figured if it didn't happen properly, we would get the flack, as always the case, right? And so there were competing proposals. And
so that, I'm gonna jump in just for the timeline. So government agrees with Richard, $100 million a year in December, and then that gave them 6 months to June of 2024 to select this organization to figure out what that structure was going to be. There was an open request for proposals.
I think it's important too to note that these are publishers and also broadcasters.
Yes.
Just it's not just the written word.
No, it's publishers. 70% of the funding is allocated for publishers. 30% for broadcasters, and 7%. Those don't add up. I'm sorry. After you take out 7% for the CBC, which is our public broadcaster. So Google put out an RFP for a collective, and they made their decision in June of 2024. So it's been 2 years almost. We're getting there.
So policy advisor and former California State Senator Steve Glazier this morning from the main stage talked about news organizations not agreeing, not being united. What really made a difference here?
What made a difference in Canada?
Yeah.
I think it was completely different circumstances. And again, we were willing to come to the table and find a solution. And we were also willing to come to the table with an eye on how could we do this in the best possible way. Because and I don't want to go into the alternate scenarios. You can read Michael Geist, who went through it all in tremendous detail. But I don't want to play that out here. But that's really the difference. It wasn't a legislative solution because, as you said, the law C-18 basically doesn't matter, right? We're exempt from it. And clearly, Facebook has basically said we are exempted ourselves by not including news. So in the end, what happened in Canada was not really a legislative solution beyond the notion of using legislation as a cudgel to try to guide people to the table.
Erin, can you speak about sort of the newsroom's role in this?
Sure. I think a big key, and this is so in the weeds. I hope this is what people want to actually hear because we're really talking about the mechanics of this deal. But I'll go there. I think one of the big differences is that the fund, once it was agreed how this funding was going to be distributed, and laid out in the regulations, we also have a regulator who ultimately is overseeing this and ensuring that what the Canadian Journalism Collective is doing, the agreement that we struck with Google, is compliant with the law. And so they're like a CRTC. They regulate, telecoms usually, broadcast. But it's sort of like created a third-party arbiter that all of the different news organizations, and we aren't a big happy family, I will say. Like, we're still building trust, but it kind of forced us to all get together, and we made our cases to the CRTC, and at the end of the day, there was a decision made about whether the way that the CJC was coming together was aligned with the law. That's their job, is to ensure that. And so that really helped get this thing over the line, because I honestly am not sure that the industry, if left to our own devices, would have been able to come to consensus about exactly how to do this. Like, it's very hard. It's a very wide tent that the Canadian Journalism Collective represents. We have everything from, large corporate media that is owned by hedge funds to small nonprofits that are serving, to community-owned radio stations that are serving remote Indigenous communities. So it's a lot of different players at the table that all have to come to some kind of consensus on this, and I think having that regulatory framework was very necessary to get us there.
I think you should tell us about the positives. I mean, it's early yet because you have the funds, but talk about the positives that have come out of this, Erin.
Sure. I mean, again, it's very early. So the Canadian Journalism Collective was selected as the organization to distribute the funding in June of last year, and it's a new organization. So, we established a nonprofit. We had to develop a governance structure. We're all doing this in a regulatory structure where the regulator is looking over our shoulder to make sure that we're dotting our I's and crossing our T's. And managing all the politics of that at the same time. And we're just getting to the point where we're able to write our first checks, within the next couple of weeks. So we don't yet, I'd say whether or not the impact will be positive in terms of the Canadian news ecosystem is something we won't know for a couple of years. What we're doing, but what some of the positives are and some of the foundations are, is that because the organization that was selected was very representative of independent media, it's really kind of changed the power structure a little bit in Canada, where a lot of the policies, and C-18, we didn't get into this, but C-18 is just the latest policy intervention that the Canadian government has done in the journalism space. We've been doing different experiments around this through labor tax credits and the local journalism initiative and subscription tax credits since 2016. And independent small media had always been an afterthought to those policies that really were designed to better suit the business models of our larger corporate media. And that's pretty natural when the power structure and the lobbying resources live there, right? The problem with that, if you zoom out and think about it from the public interest perspective and the Canadian news consumers' perspective, is that those are the organizations that businesses are shrinking and they're laying off a lot. Whereas where we're seeing growth is among these new entrants, and there's necessary tension built into that shift that is very hard to deal with, right? Every new job that's created in Canada by an independent means a little bit less money through this fund for everybody who employs journalists. So it's almost like the news organizations that are the members of the CJC have a vested interest in Canadian journalism jobs not growing in Canada. It's a very strange incentive structure. So one of the outcomes that I think is very positive is because the proposal that ultimately was selected really centered diverse business models. What we really tried to do was ensure that there was very strong transparency. that the governance structure represented lots of different types of business models, nonprofit, big, small. We were mandated by the law to include Indigenous, Black, and racialized communities on the broadcast side as well. We really are like a unique organization in Canada that truly does represent the entire ecosystem. We're the only one like that. And so I hope that some positive things come of us working together, because I think if we can get on the same page about the objectives, we can make the pie bigger. And we're gonna do better doing that by working together, rather than like fighting amongst ourselves, right? Putting all of our energy there to fight over the scraps. I'd rather like bring everyone together and look at how can we negotiate better deals around AI licensing, for example, together. So these are some of the things I'm looking forward to. It's also a really interesting organization in terms of the data that we're collecting around what is actually happening. So I think we'll be able to tell you very clearly within 2 years whether this funding has actually led to more journalists being employed in Canada. Because we have a complete data set of every organization that says that they're news and where they're spending their money, which is a pretty valuable research asset that has not existed up until now. So I'm really excited about the research implications of that as well. And at the end of the day, it's about equity. I think if you look at Australia and you see how that deal went down initially, a number of larger organizations got checks, and other folks got either delayed or left out in the cold entirely. And that was kind of the road that we were on in Canada. Before Google agreed to C18, we had our showcase licensing deals, which I know is something that also was in Canada, where Google got to pick and choose which organizations that they were going to enter into agreements with. There was NDAs around all of them, so I have no idea what the Globe and Mail got from that, or what. Discourse never succeeded in getting one of those agreements, which I complained to Richard about a lot. He didn't listen to me. Well. It's okay, I know. But the point was, Google got to decide what was eligible and what was ineligible, and there was not transparency about how those deals were negotiated. And so if you wanted to actually equitably impact everyone, you have to have some transparency and have the same deal for everyone, and that's really what we're trying to achieve at the Canadian Journalism
So
Collective.
just a point of clarification on that, because again, clearly the preferred approach is what we did here, where we're not in that position of making decisions. The situation in Australia that you refer to, precisely. However, you should understand that the insistence on there being no disclosure of the deals was on the publisher side, not on the Google side. And you can do your own calculations as to why that might have been the case.
Yeah, and we're still fighting that at the CJC about transparency of data. Not everybody wants to share their data.
If you look in Canada, for instance, at the percentage of an operations expense that goes into the newsroom, you look at the digital players, it's like 75 to 80%. You look at some of the legacy players, particularly those who are owned by hedge funds, it's like 13%.
We do have time for questions if anyone wants to. I wanted to mention as well, INN does have members in Canada, and Erin spoke a bit about these sites that were springing up and continue to spring up all over Canada with misinformation and disinformation and fake news. And I just wanted to say about INN members too, we have standards. Not everybody gets to be an INN member. And I say that also because we're sitting here quite a bit talking about transparency. That's really a big piece of the equation that these news outlets are producing original reporting, and that they're transparent about who funds them. Are there any questions? Does anybody want to take a stab? Yes, hello.
So I'm Sally Lehrman.
Let's get you a mic, Sally.
Thanks. I'm Sally. Oh, go ahead, Richard.
No, go ahead.
I'm Sally Lehrman from the Trust Project, and we also have news partners in Canada and really saw what was happening when Meta suddenly pulled out and some of the other repercussions. So I actually have a question for both Erin and Richard. Erin, you talked a little bit about the innovation that was spurred by this, and we actually had a workshop about that trying to help. So I'd love for you to elaborate a bit more on that. And then Richard, like now there is a commitment to a certain amount of funding from Google to Canada. Will that be the cap? So in essence, has your GNI operations essentially, or Google's GNI operations essentially pulled away from additional funding as a result of this?
Yeah, in terms of innovation, oh, so many examples. But I mean, it's everything from doing direct mail. There was some very clever advertising about Facebook and why we shouldn't be investing in that anymore. But yeah, direct mail, doing email is like a very important thing. WhatsApp, which again is another Meta product, but one that at least is like an owned channel that's encrypted, and all products that were designed to, rather than keep news organization or keep news consumers like within Facebook getting content, like bringing you back to the site and working to build those all sorts of different tactics, working to build that habit of looking to the news homepage. It's having we were talking about that last night. Like the homepage itself is having a bit of a renaissance in Canada. Podcasting, local podcasting has been a really interesting piece that people have used as well. But the bottom line of all of these experiments and innovation is really how can we build our own distribution channels directly with our audiences. There's been some really events and partnering with community organizations. Some of the news organizations that we work with have done really interesting things with libraries, for example, to activate those relationships and then invite audience members to subscribe directly rather than looking to discover our news through these other products. So a lot of, and again, like advertising to our consumers so that they can understand how they need to engage with us to get our news. But it's an uphill battle for sure. Like I don't want to overstate that like we were able to replace the hole that was created when Meta pulled news content off. There's been some winners, but there's been more losers for sure. So I also don't want to like gloss over that.
As far as our overall spend given these kinds of policies, well, in Canada, as was noted, once we made this commitment, we let expire all of the showcase agreements. So the showcase money got replaced with the money going into the fund. We'll see. I think it remains to be seen exactly how robustly we will continue forward with other programs. We would like to, but there are financial realities to any business, right, that one simply has to recognize. In fact, to this point, if I might, because you were touching on the Stephen Glazier point, rather than go at specifically that policy proposal, though one could, I think all of us recognize that public policy relating to the press is a very, very nuanced thing that you have to approach very, very carefully. I'd say a couple of high-level points of guidance if one's going to go in that direction. If a society wants to pass a law to support journalism, great. Is it done on a financial basis that is durable, right? One of the problems with these laws is they focus on a couple of specific companies. And that might be fine now, but here we are in this tremendous AI revolution where the great success of Google past may not be the success of Google future. Right, so are you looking at that source of revenue at such a broad base that you're protected from that, right? Are you doing it in such a fashion with a broad base that it isn't subject to constitutional challenge, which that would likely have been the case in California? Once you've gotten there, again, how do you handle the distribution of the funds? And how do you do that, particularly in complex political environments, where there's going to be a whole lot of dispute and challenge as to where those dollars go? And I think the last point to keep in mind is, what I've always felt is if you want a truly independent free press, you do not want to be reliant on large singular sources of funding, right? Philanthropy isn't a business model, nor is platform support a business model. So I think the opportunity and the challenge, and I do think it's opportunity, I see it, is how can we build these businesses, how can we build local news businesses that are more broadly sustainable, that are seen and valued by people in the community, and can indeed help build those communities. So if we can take those things in mind in crafting public policy, we'd be in a better position. The last point I should make is, yes, avoid almost suicidal aspects, like, for instance, a link tax, which is counterproductive. So again, public policy done smartly can be helpful, but let's be really thoughtful on the potential negative and secondary consequences in doing so.
I think we have time for one more question. I see 2 hands in the back. Oh dear, and I don't have my glasses on, so. A microphone is walking towards.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Hi, it's Tom Hudson with WLRN Public Media based
Hi,
here
Tom.
in Miami. So welcome to Miami for those of you who are new. It's nice to see you, Karen. I'd be curious about your view of Section 230 here in the United States. And how might reform efforts around Section 230 in the United States play into some of the lessons that you all have learned in Canada?
Well, I think if one is going to undertake reform of Section 230, then I hope literally it's within the context of modest reformation rather than cancellation. And of course, the buzz you hear now is more about cancellation. In fact, a lot of people across the spectrum have said, why does 230 even exist? If you look back at the history, and a lot of people misunderstand Section 230, right? Section 230 did not relieve us of, what it said basically is it encouraged, it was prescient in saying, we recognize in this new world where everyone can express themselves, there will be value in moderation. There'll be value in people taking those steps to make sure that particularly heinous and awful and illegal content is not there, right? And so Section 230 was precisely to give liability protection to those in the task of moderation, right? That's what it was about. And those who are pushing now for it to be gone is because they don't want moderation to happen at all. And if moderation does happen, they want to be very free and able to use all the money they have to sue those entities such that they won't do that again, right? So are there opportunities to reform Section 230 in positive ways? Yes. But what I fear in this political climate is it won't go in that direction at all. And that's certainly not the inclination, at least best as I hear, out of current administration.
Were you going to say something, Erin?
No.
Okay.
No, I will not. I'm going to leave the Canadian.
Yeah.
I'll leave you guys to your 230. We have very strong hate and libel laws in Canada, which we'll lend to you if you'd like.
Okay. There have been many night media forums, and 3 or 4 years ago, policy conversations weren't really on the agenda. So there are a few this time. This was on the main stage at the beginning of the conference, and there are a couple of sessions about policy as lever and about different legislative acts and different agreements that have been made to support local journalism. So I just want to kind of acknowledge that arc and there are real challenges and tensions around it. So thank you, everyone, for coming today.